middle of anything. During the 14th and 15th century, however, Italian humanists, following the lead of a poet named Petrarch, began to speak of history as consisting of three periods, not six: an ancient period, a middle period, and a modern period. The ancient period coincided with the age of classical Greece and Rome. It was a period when literature and art had flourished. The middle period, which followed the fall of the Roman Empire, was a period of cultural rot and decay as people lost sight of classical literary and artistic values. The modern period would be the age of a renaissance, a rebirth of culture that the humanists were going to bring about. The first humanists saw themselves as living in the middle period, during the period of rot and decay. But during the course of the 14th and 15th centuries, more and more humanists became convinced that they were in fact living in the third period, the age of a renaissance. And thus, during the 14th and 15th centuries, the Middle Ages came to be recognized only in the act of its own destruction. Modern historians, in order to convey just how much changed during the Middle Ages, which after all lasted for more than a millennium, conventionally divide the Middle Ages into three parts: the early Middle Ages, which lasted to roughly 1000 AD, the High Middle Ages, lasting to roughly 1300 AD, and the Late Middle Ages, lasting to circa 1500 AD, and which will be the subject of this course. Of these three periods, the Late Middle Ages is in some ways the most difficult and challenging to study. Historians often grouse about many different things, and one of the things they most like to grouse about is how few and how inadequate their sources are. But historians of the Late Middle Ages, if anything, have a different problem. They have too many sources with which to work. Literacy rates were higher than they had ever been before in European history, and as a result, an enormous number of documents were generated. Even a medium-sized town in southern Europe will have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of commercial contracts crammed into its archives, and it would take many lifetimes for a single historian to make his or her way through a single such archive. Because the printing press is not invented until circa 1450, most of the documents generated during the Late Middle Ages are handwritten and very laborious to read. So there's a practical problem involved in studying the 14th and the 15th centuries, but there are also conceptual problems involved. Just as those who lived during the 14th and 15th centuries were of two minds as to whether they were living in the Middle Ages or living in the Renaissance, so too modern historians have found themselves struggling to define this period and its essential characteristics. It is a curious fact that a historian who specializes in Italian history during the 14th and 15th centuries would be called a Renaissance historian, whereas a historian who studied any other part of Europe during that same period would be regarded as a medieval historian, as if to travel across the Alps in 1400 was to travel through time itself. Renaissance and medieval historians have their own journals, their own professional organizations, their own conferences, and as a result, they are not always as aware of each other's work as they really should be. There's a corollary to this confusion about whether the 14th and 15th centuries are part of the Middle Ages or not. The early and the High Middle Ages have well-defined images that have proven remarkably resistant to various attempts to change those images. The early Middle Ages are commonly understood to be the Dark Ages, a low point in European history. The High Middle Ages are generally seen to be a period of economic and cultural growth. It's the age of the chivalric romance, the age of Gothic cathedrals, the age of Thomas Aquinas. The Late Middle Ages, on the other hand, has no single defining image, either negative or positive. And rather, there are competing visions of the Late Middle Ages. Some of these depict the period as a somber age of repeated catastrophe. Others see this period as a time of unprecedented cultural vitality, originality, and of human progress. Three modern historians especially have played an important role in creating both scholarly and popular visions of the 14th and 15th centuries. The Swiss historian Jakob Burckhardt, the Dutch historian Johann Huizinga, and the American historian Barbara Tuchman. Jakob Burckhardt came from the Swiss town of Basel. His father, a clergyman and a historian in his own right, intended his son to be a clergyman as well, but Burckhardt abandoned his theological studies while still a young man.